Honors College and a professor of English at Nova Southeastern University. She graduated from Florida International University with a bachelor's in business. She has a Master of Arts in English and a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Miami, also with a PhD in English. Dr. Andrea Nevins. Her areas of academic focus are Caribbean literature and popular culture, as well as creative writing. Dr. Nevins is author of The Embodiment of Disobedience, Fat Black Women's Unruly Political Bodies and Working Juju. Representations of the Caribbean, fantastic. And I could go on, but the person she is, I know she doesn't want me to, she just wants to go straight into what she has to do. So we welcome Dr. Andrea Nevins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donnelly, and many thanks to the Louis Bennett Heritage Council for inviting me to have this opportunity to serve as moderator. I am honored to have this role. Professor Kai Miller is a colleague in the literary world, a friend, and one of Jamaica's best known and most accomplished, indeed the Caribbean's best known and most accomplished writers. Kai Miller is a Jamaican essayist, poet, and novelist. He is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Miami and director of the MFA program. He has won the Forward Prize for Poetry, the Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, the Chomley Award for Poetry, and in 2018 was named the Sabga Arts and Letters Laureate for the Caribbean. His books include the novel Augustown, the poetry collection The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, and the nonfiction collection Things I Have Withheld. Please join me in welcoming Professor Miller. We look forward to his talk. And this is a reminder that as the talk takes place, participants are invited to post questions in the chat. All right, Professor Miller.
All right, thank you. And can I get the screen? Which I will do just to show share. All right, hi everyone. And my screen is obvious, is sharing? I hope it is.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so Jamaica's highest, okay, great. Miss Latetia and Miss Lou. Jamaica's highest national honor is the Order of the National Hero. According to the Act of Parliament that created this award, it's given to those who have rendered to the nation services of the most distinguished nature. This will be at the heart of our discussion today. Miss Lou and Latetia feature less than you might think. We will come to them and the questions of why they might have been left out. But this talk is more interested in posing questions than answering them. And the questions I really want to ask are about this award, the national hero, and more importantly, the ground from which these heroes rise, a ground quite unlike the physical earth which still holds stubbornly onto their bodies and their bones, but a looser ground that allows them room to move and live and breathe. I'm talking here about the ground of narrative. I'm asking questions about the national heroes, but by extension, the national story. There is much to say, and I want to jump into it quickly. But first, let me give some thanks and acknowledgements. First and foremost to you for being here, taking time to listen, to sit down together with me and talk about a little culture. To Maxine and Malachi and Donnelly and all the members of the council, thank you for asking me to do this, for putting up with me. I am not a fan of emails and that sort of thing, so you have to be a little resilient to get in touch with me. Maxine and Malachi are resilient, and I am grateful for it. And Professor Andrea Shaw, whose work I have read, whose work I have referenced, whose company over the years I have kept at one line or another, and who I think on just a fundamental level is a good person. I'm always happy to be in conversation with good people. So Andrea, thanks. Miss Lou, of course, you will already know it is in her name and legacy that I give these remarks. And many of you probably know and appreciate her more than I do, even better than I do. Latetia Gohagan, however, is a name I imagine you are less familiar with. And that is a shame. Because if in our pantheon of heroes we count it as a particularly noteworthy sacrifice, those who gave up their bones and their blood for freedom and justice, then Latetia Gohagan gave one hell of a sacrifice. Before the sun had set on the 24th of October, my birthday, 1865, Miss Letitia's neck had been broken on the gallows of Morant Bay, and so too the neck of her husband, James Gohagan, and so too the necks of their 4 living sons. And by virtue of still occupying a place in his mother's womb at the time of her execution, murdered as well was the as yet unborn and unnamed child of James and Letitia. So furious was Governor Eyre at her role in the rebellion, so intent was he that her and her kin should be wiped off the face of the earth, scrubbed almost completely out of the historical record, that she should be dismissed and her name forgotten. It is a crying shame that he got his wish. Well, that's a kind of dark preview of what is to come, and in all honesty, to lay my cards on the table, it's a little manipulative. I've teased you about an injustice that is on the horizon, the lives that will be lost, and the petulant governor orchestrating it all. I'm pushing you already to take sides. That's what storytellers do. One way or another, we try to lure you into the story, into the who, into the where, into the when, into the why, into the what lessons do we learn from this? Inside the story is all consuming. A story well told demands all your attention and all of your imagination. But I want to do something different today. As much as I want to invite you inside the story, I also want to offer you a perch above it. I want to offer you a much broader, a less emotional context in which to receive and think about my remarks today. I want to offer you a place not only inside the story, but outside of it as well, to think about the very act of telling stories and why we do it. So for the next 10 minutes, allow me to set out that broad context, this perch way above the story. It might not seem relevant at first. I can only ask for your patience. Trust me, it is. For as long as I can remember, I have been interested and invested in stories, in storytelling and narrative. I think it is the same for all of us. As a kid, I can remember listening to my parents and grandparents telling any number of anecdotes, family lore, office drama. I can remember watching cartoons, reading comics, being a bratty little tattletale, running back to mommy or daddy to report my sister, or running to miss at the front of the classroom to report that little boy or girl for what they did. Always, we are telling stories. As an adult, I have made a living writing stories, novels, essays, poems. I also observe myself being swept up by other narratives, reading books, reading newspapers, and breaking political stories, following podcasts, checking Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, watching sports, watching new TV series, movies, on and on. I recognize not only in myself, but in the human, an obsession with narrative. Sylvia Winter. This is a name you must remember. She's going to come up a couple times. She's simply one of the most intellectually gifted people the world has produced, and one of the most important theorists of our times. A retired professor from Stanford. If we are talking about unsung Jamaican women heroes, she's one. She's our own. Born in Cuba to Jamaican parents, Sylvia Winter left UWI Mona for Stanford. No slight on UWI at all, but Winter probably needed an institution that could better accommodate the weight of her intellect. Her brave open letter slash essay, No Humans Involved, in the wake of the Rodney King riots, is one of the founding documents of critical race theory as we know it today. Some of us are old enough to remember those days and nights of rioting after a jury failed to convict 4 police officers responsible for King's brutal beating. With new technology and surveillance cameras proliferating so many of our spaces, it is now much more commonplace to capture police on film. But in 1991, this was a rare find. And just because an amateur videographer happened to be nearby, happened to be able to run down and collect his camera, put in its batteries, happened to be able to run back outside, and the beating had gone on long enough that he was able to capture the final moments in all its gory details. That phrase, no humans involved, turned up as a shorthand attached to several police reports made by the LAPD involving incidents with black and brown subjects. The implication was chilling. Yes, there were casualties involved, but at least none of them were really human. Winter's essay is not directed to the police department, but to her colleagues at Stanford. She's asking, who do we study as human? Who is human? Whose culture is worthy of research? How are we as an academy a part of this? It would be impossible for me to summarize the breadth and complexity of Winter's work, but if I had to condense it to one instruction, it is this. Sylvia Winter tells us to pay attention to the human as a product of biology and as a product of culture and story. She wants us to ask the question both from the inside and the outside, not just who am I or who are we, but also what exactly is the human? As a species, what is the Homo sapien? Who are we? And how did we as a species get here? I am going to listen to Sylvia Winter and take us back in time, a long, long, long time ago, as stories so often begin. Traveling so far back, we will go beyond history and into prehistory, the prehistoric period. We're not going deep into that period. Most of that past is unavailable to us. But we'll settle at the edge, a mere 40,000 years ago, when something dramatic changed, and that change would slowly bring about the end of prehistory and the beginning of the period we've now been in for some 4,000 years, the historic period. This moment 40,000 years ago is fascinating because it is in fact the last time that there was not one, but 2 different species of humans inhabiting the planet at the same time. We have been alone for so long, it is difficult to imagine that. 2 kinds of humans, not living together or intermingled no more than you would expect to see a combined pack of lions and tigers, or even though both are cats, or a combined herd of horses and zebras, though they are both equid. But like lions and tigers and like horses and zebras, Homo sapiens, that's us, and Homo neanderthals, and Homo neanderthalensis were close enough in genetic structure that they could, though it was rare, they could interbreed and create cross-species humans. I've created this slide just because I love these moments when you see like a half horse, half zebra, or a half lion, half tiger. Anyway, the 2 species of humans shared more than just genetic markers. They both had learned how to use and manipulate fire. They both were skilled in making and using tools. They both developed social structures that included caring for the sick and elderly. They both used basic herbal medicines, and they both had rudimentary language skills. So what changed? What are the factors that contributed to the extinction of the Neanderthal on one hand and our survival on the other? And is it the same factors that led to not just our survival, but to our thriving, and then to our absolute domination of the planet? Yes, those rudimentary language skills I mentioned, they stayed rudimentary for the Neanderthal, but grew more and more complex for the Homo sapien. The Neanderthal could only use language to describe what is. The Homo sapien, however, learned how to be abstract. He was able to describe not just what is, but also what was, as well what might be, and also what could be. Our language could suddenly differentiate time. How did that help? I'm stealing this example from Yuval Harari's brilliant book Sapiens. You see, while the Neanderthal could say, look, lion, run, the sapien could say, lion might come here tomorrow at sunset. We should hide in tree with spears. Being able to plan for the lion was a very practical advantage. But the bigger advantage, the much more profound advantage, was not obvious at first. It happened slowly and incrementally. It is not enough to say that it changed our history. Complex language is what led to the beginning of history. Much more powerful than being able to plan for the lion was being able to tell the story of how the lion was defeated. You see, the change was that we as Homo sapiens had discovered story. With this ability, the sapient humans were able to form groups much larger than the paltry 10 to 50 that Neanderthal humans made up their bands with. Sapiens began to live and gather in groups of hundreds, and then thousands, and then eventually millions. People all held together by a common story. The story of how the lion was defeated was soon not just the story of the clan, but the story of the tribe, which over time became the story of the kingdom, which in time would become the story of the nation. Not everyone had to defeat the lion, you just had to belong to the story of the people who defeated the lion. Not everyone had to swim across the river and wrestle the crocodile, you just had to belong to that story. Not everyone has to run 9.58 seconds in Berlin. You just have to belong to that story. Not everyone has to march to Morant Bay Courthouse in 1865 to demand basic justice and be hanged for the audacity of claiming your worth. You just have to belong to that story, to the people who claim this as their story, as part of the story of their nation. Every nation looks to its past and selects a few powerful stories to tell. And from those stories, we pick our heroes and heroines. That's what we're talking about today. That's what we're talking about today. How nations select and tell their stories and the heroes they choose from those stories. You see, when I say I'm interested in stories and storytelling, it is not just some romantic longing for a cliched old woman or man sitting around a fire and telling a Nancy stories, though it is that sometimes. It is an interest in the most fundamental part of our humanity, the very engine of it. On August 6, 1962, Jamaica became an independent nation. The British Union Jack was lowered for the last time, and in its place rose the black and green and gold saltire. Between 1966 and 1967, a lecturer from the University of the West Indies authored a working paper on behalf of the government in which he provided a rationale for the establishment of a major national award, the Order of National Hero. The name of that lecturer, seen here, you have heard already, was Sylvia Winter. You see, if we look to the architect of the award, we will realize the idea of the Jamaican national hero is not just patriotic jingoism. It is not just another exercise in chest thumping, flag waving, empty but earnest expressions of nationalism. Sylvia Wynter was already thinking about the human, the Homo sapien, the storytelling animal, as Jonathan Gottschall would later call us, and thinking about the ways in which a gathering of Homo sapiens might intentionally use particular narratives as a way to frame and make sense of their lives. Sylvia Wynter, who theorizes the human, I think, quite accurately as being hybrid, as being part biology, part story. The Homo sapien as a species is not just a storytelling animal, but a story-dwelling animal. We live inside narrative in a way that no other creature does. We imagine our lives as directed. The human who lives a life without direction, that is to say, a life without narrative, is seen as living a wasted life. We also want our lives to be meaningful, but meaning can only ever be a product of narrative. It is not just that humanity depends on narrative, but that humanity and narrative are synonyms. In these early days of Jamaican independence, the intellectuals understood the task at hand, that they had the chance to be very deliberate in selecting and curating a small group of stories that could become the story of the nation, narratives to which the ordinary Jamaican citizen is expected to look and find in it both their most fundamental definition and their highest aspirations. My simple intervention here is to say that we who are defined by those stories have the right every now and then to inspect them. Winter submits her paper, and in 1968, the National Awards, and in 1968, the National Honors and Awards Act is passed. And in 1969, Prime Minister Hugh Shearer introduces Jamaica's first 5 national heroes, Marcus Garvey, Paul Bogle, George William Gordon, Norman Manley, and still alive to have the medal pinned to his lapel, Alexander Bustamante. It is worth filling in some of the background to these first choices. First, the pair of peers, Paul Bogle and George William Gordon as one pair, Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante as the second. These were predictable choices, by which I do not mean at all to question their worthiness, just their predictability. These men, after all, were the heroes of parliamentary Jamaica. The Morant Bay Rebellion was a pivotal moment in the political history of the island. Pay attention to the colored picture, Barrington Watson's depiction of that rebellion. Watson did a great deal of research while composing this image, and what you might find particularly interesting is the fact that he does not feature Paul Bogle or George William Gordon. We know for a fact that George William Gordon was not present, and according to Watson, neither was Bogle, at least not on the very first day of the uprising. If you follow the story, this actually makes a lot of sense. Instead, Watson features characters that aren't often featured in the history books, like Paul Bogle's brother carrying the torch. I'm interested in the solitary woman who makes it into this composition, wearing an orange headband that looks like an eruption of flames. What is she carrying in her apron? Ackee, perhaps, to sell at the market? Is she a casual vendor who by accident got caught up in the midst of this rebellion? Unlikely. I would like to think that this could be the only artistic rendering of Latetia Gohagan, and what she carries in her apron are not just fruit, but the very projectiles which, when thrown, officially commenced the days of violence to come. Latetia may not have been without sin, but she did cast the first stone. In the wake of emancipation and the dismantling of the apparatus of slavery, society began to shift in ways that were too slow and incremental for some, and all too dizzyingly fast for others. The increased strength of the Party for Colored People and their increased presence on the benches of the assembly had many of the white former planters worried and even incensed. Nowhere was this seething anger more obvious than in the body and manner of the then colonial governor, Edward John Eyre. Now, Edward Eyre was a career colonialist. When other boys his age were joining the army or going to university, Eyre had set sail for Australia to bring to heel the landscape and the people. He had spent decades between New Zealand and Australia working as the muscle and the law of the British Empire. When he finally arrived in Jamaica as governor, slavery had ended just a single generation before, and the planters were still holding a grudge. They celebrated the arrival of Eyre and cheered on his every move. This was the savior they had prayed for, a man who might not be able to reinstate slavery itself, but at least could bring the Negroes to heel, as he had the Aboriginals of the Great Down Under. George William Gordon held a seat in the Assembly. He was, in essence, the MP for East St. Thomas, or St. Thomas in the East, as it was called back then. And in this capacity was a particularly troublesome thorn in the side of the governor. So too was Gordon's great political ally, Paul Bogle, one of only 102 men in St. Thomas in the East who, by virtue of owning enough land and actually paying the appropriate taxes, had the right to vote and served in the local vestry. What ensued after could probably best be described as political hokey pokey. The people vote them in, the governor kick them out. The people vote them in, the governor shake them all about. Suffice to say, there was tension in the air. And so when the governor decides to up the ante, antagonize the people of St. Thomas even further by laying down and imposing some real draconian laws, and a day of extraordinary violence breaks out in St. Thomas, leaving 16 British officials dead, Eyre, deeply embarrassed and deeply terrified, employs a scorched earth tactic. He sets out to destroy and kill any and everyone who had anything to do with the uprising. It is this logic, this fear, and this paranoia that leads him to arrest George William Gordon, miles away in Kingston, who, though sympathetic towards it, was completely uninvolved in these particular happenings in his constituency. William Gordon is quickly tried, is found guilty, and is hanged. And it is on this death, on this particular lynched body, that the political history of Jamaica turns. There were other bodies, another 14 of them lynched, 464 of them shot to death, and 600 of them whipped, brutalized, and mutilated, but sent home barely alive. These casualties are only ever regarded as statistics. In the body of George William Gordon, England finally saw a human who was treated unfairly. Every movement benefits from a martyr, and now the party for colored people had theirs. The immediate and short-term aftermath for these mulattoes was a loss of political power, but what was lost as parliamentary seats was gained in the form of sympathy and the bent ear of the empire. England was listening. Years later, when this group of largely mixed-race Jamaicans had recovered from this setback, when the country started marching again towards universal adult suffrage, voting rights for all Jamaicans, they did so under the name of George William Gordon. In 1960, the Jamaican Parliament would move into a building also named after him, Gordon House. And so these names, Paul Bogle, George William Gordon, and the two cousins, Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamantes, whose parties, the JLP and the PNP, together represented the modern-day iteration of the Party of Free Colors, it is unsurprising that this particular Jamaican parliament would name these four as national heroes. Marcus Garvey, for some, was a more surprising addition. The announcement that he was officially the first national hero was not met with universal applause. There were some head scratches, some accusations of tokenism, and others just laughed. It was certainly a surprising move for the Hugh Shearer government, whose greatest anxiety at the time was Black power and any kind of expression of Black nationalism. Jamaica at this moment is deep in its out of many one people phase, a particularly helpful mantra of legitimacy for a parliament that did not look exactly like the majority of Jamaicans. Shearer had also made some embarrassing overreaches. In 1968, he banned the book Black Beauty. Black Beauty, as many of you know, is a story about a horse. It is the horse's name that is Black Beauty. Shearer clearly had not read the book, but the action of banning it became both hilarious and deeply chilling. That the mere idea of Black people asserting and claiming their beauty was seen as seditious. Shearer went further and banned all the publications of Walter Rodney, a Black Guyanese intellectual working at UWI, but refusing to keep his research ensconced in the walls of the so-called Ivory Tower. Rodney toured the island holding reasoning sessions with common folk, peasant farmers in rural villages, ordinary workers in the city, Rastafari brethren and sistren. So when Rodney set out to attend the Conference of Black Writers in Quebec, Shearer took the opportunity to ban him completely from the island. If there was time and space, I would unravel for you all the surprising ways in which Shearer's expulsion of Walter Rodney from UWI Mona and from Jamaica completely echoed so many of the ways in which Eyre had worked to expel Paul Bogle from the local vestry of St. Thomas, and how the resulting Rodney riots that erupted on campus and spread out till it enveloped the entire city of Kingston, a set of riots that began with a march to Parliament, how in sequence, in ethos, and ultimately in its suppression, it echoed the Morant Bay Rebellion and proved that many of the tensions from 100 years before remained unresolved. In any case, it was a surprise for some that 6 months later, after these riots, this deeply anti-Black nationalism government should select the most potent symbol of that movement as the first national hero was for some a surprise. Or perhaps it was precisely because of that. Hugh Shearer had to throw a bone to the public. For years, Garvey had been an off-again, on-again hero of the Jamaican folk. His was a peripatetic life, a constant hustle, moving from one country to another, living here for a couple of years, living there for a couple of years, at first making progress, gaining traction, but always things seem to blow up in the end. And when Garvey's back is against the wall, he lashes out in ways that some people thought was particularly vindictive and nasty. Whether that's his deceitful wife or his corrupt and thieving lieutenants or the self-hating Black Americans or even the Jamaican public itself that he dismisses on more than one occasion when they don't react warmly enough to his speech as unsophisticated Negroes who had no chance ever to reach his particular level of sophistication. Garvey, it seems, is always getting in his own way until he died. Richard Hart, writing in 1969, probably trying to make sense of Garvey as a new national hero, reflects on how Garvey's death led to his radical resurrection, his incremental but thorough rehabilitation in the eyes and hearts of regular Jamaican folk. I noted before that every movement benefits from a martyr, and Marcus Garvey in death had become exactly that. One of the paradoxes I find myself contending with is that Garveyism, the movement, in its intellect and in its integrity, for me, far exceeds the man, Garvey. In any case, by the 1960s, Garvey's name was suddenly on every politician's lips. A cheap political trick, a way to signal their own identification with the working class. But also in 1964, the young culture minister, Edward Seaga, had himself spearheaded the move to have Garvey's remains returned and re-entombed in Jamaica, and specifically at the already designated National Heroes Park. So while some expressed surprise, I think Garvey's addition was inevitable as well. 5 years later, in 1974, debate emerges in Parliament as Colonel C.L.G. Harris of the Windward Maroons and an opposition senator argues for Nani's installation as national hero. This is a revealing moment in Maroon history and their own imagination of nation. The 18th century Maroon treaties had left the Maroons with some sense of political autonomy. In some ways, they existed as a nation within a nation, like Lesotho or the Vatican City. They were the Maroons who happened to reside in Jamaica. Post-emancipation meant it was difficult, if not impossible, to maintain those boundaries between Jamaica and Maroon country. CLG Harris is, if nothing else, a savvy politician who understands the changing times and probably recognizes the fact that if Maroon identity is to be preserved, then it must be embedded into the national story. Put differently, he wants the story of the tribe to become the story of the nation, the story of the Maroons to become the story of Jamaica. But something else had happened. Manley stepped into this new phase of his political life, into this new phase of his political life, with his third wife, Beverly Anderson Manley, on his arms. Proudly black, eloquent, wearing Afrocentric clothes and elevating the tie head of the peasant to uptown couture. Beverly was a political force in her own right, throwing her weight and voice behind the women's movement of the 70s. The image of Beverly Anderson as First Lady of Jamaica made Nanny an imaginable hero. Prime Minister Michael Manley is moved enough to commission a committee led by Kamau Brathwaite to research, to report, and to recommend. Though much of the legwork is done under the Manley administration, the final official exaltation of both Nanny of the Maroons and Sam Sharp to the high throne of national hero happened under the Edward Seaga-led government of the early 1980s. Sam Sharp fills in other holes in the story. With Sam Sharp, we finally had a hero from the western side of the island, and we finally had a hero who actually had been enslaved. There were Paul Bogle, it seems, had not, and Nanny, the peer that we're thinking of about her, had not. With Sam Sharp and Nanny, we now had 7 national heroes. 7, we are told by various mystics and spiritualists, is the number of completion. And certainly in Jamaica, the appetite for new heroes has waned after these first 7. These first 7, each of them with their own statues and busts, have taken on the patina of the saints, the founding mother and fathers of the nation, those whose stories are told with an air of solemnity and reverence, and those whose accomplishments we imagine cannot be matched, let alone surpassed. Every so often, various commentators, cultural critics, and agitators have asked about the possible inclusion of reggae icon Bob Marley and folklorist Louise Bennett. My own sense of where this national conversation has landed is the expression of a deep love and appreciation for both Marley and Miss Lou, but a sense that their contributions don't quite rise to that of national hero. And while we do want to honor them, we also don't want to dilute the category of national hero. And especially, we don't want to dishonor the blood and bone sacrifices made by the previous recipients. In this, the public imagination of the requirements for national hero greatly exceed its actual definition, which I remind you is given to those who have rendered to the nation services of the most distinguished nature. I have no quarrel with the public interrogation of Marley and Miss Lou. I think it's healthy. Or our questions of what constitutes services of the most distinguished nature. Or more to the point, what exactly is a national hero? I won't say these are the wrong questions, but might I suggest other questions that might be useful to include in this discussion? Not just what is a national hero, but more simply, what is a hero? Someone who wears a cape? Someone who puts his or her life on the line? Or is it something much simpler? The person who features most prominently in a story. So not just what is a national hero, but what is the national story? What are the national stories? What are the other stories that we could tell about ourselves and our tribe? What are the stories you've heard? Whenever someone asks you about Jamaica, what are the stories that you tell? Who are your heroes? And finally, yeah, who features in those stories? Who are your heroes? And finally, is the story of Jamaica still open or is it closed? Is it still being written? And does it still have space to feature new narratives as we struggle always to define who we are, as we struggle to make out of this life something meaningful? When I first thought of this lecture, it was going to be so much about Miss Lou, but now as I approach the end, she is relegated to this paragraph before we return one last time to the Morant Bay Rebellion and the events that led to Miss Latetia hanging from the gallows. I don't know what story you tell about Jamaica, but the story of Jamaica I like to tell, and that is most meaningful to me, is a story about Jamaican culture. It is a story about the Jamaican language, which for so long we were made to feel was inferior and embarrassing until Miss Lou's voice came through as if from the wilderness, telling us it is not broken, it is whole, and that we were whole. Until the music composed in that unbroken language broke through and the world was rocking to it. I believe my Jamaican story is more than the struggle towards political sovereignty, but also the struggle towards cultural sovereignty and pride. And whenever I tell that story, the person who features prominently is Louise Bennett, who didn't just do arbitrary work, she was doing the work of nation. And also Bob Marley and Toots Hibbert and Ronnie Williams, all buried at National Heroes Park, and even still living folk like Oliver Samuels. In 2010, Richard Drayton gave the Elsa Govaya lecture called The Problem of the Hero or Heroine in Caribbean History. He argued that telling history in this way, as a story of one or two extraordinary men and the occasional woman, was a way of telling history that we inherited from Europe and that almost always suppresses many of the powerful stories around. Heroic acts are almost never the actions of just one person, but many people contribute, and we really ought to find a way to tell those stories. So here is as much as I know about Latetia. On October 7th, 1865, sorry, on October 7th, 1865, a man is put on trial for trespassing on land, a plantation that had long been abandoned. It is an empty lot, a common thoroughfare for the people of St. Thomas. But Governor Eyre is laying down the law hard, and black people are not allowed to walk on white people's land, even if that land is abandoned. He is tried and he is convicted. One man in the gallery, James Gohagan, dares to shout out in the courtroom, protesting the injustice of it all. He may have said, "This is foolishness," or it may have been more colorful. But the laws as they were meant, you couldn't even protest injustice. The redcoats tried to arrest James Gohagan, but they are thwarted by the crowds. Gohagan runs away and the police run after him. Over the next couple of days, tensions remain high and boiling over. Warrants are issued. The names topping this list include Gohagan, of course, but also Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. Bogle is protected by his people who send the arresting officers away. They return without Bogle, but with freshly inflicted bruises on their bodies. The people of St. Thomas have also sent a message. They will not submit themselves willingly to this overreach, but they will march peacefully into Morant Bay tomorrow to have audience with the authorities. On October 11th, they arrive in Morant Bay to find a heavily armed militia, uninterested in dialogue, but very interested in suppression. Amidst all the bullying and shouting and shoving, it is Latetia who finally throws the first stone, and with that fearless act begins the war. For her role in all this, Latetia Gehagen shares the same fate as Paul Bogle and George William Gordon and James Gehagen, her husband. The couple, along with their 4 sons, are hanged from the gallows. And despite the enormity of their sacrifice, very soon their names are forgotten. The silence around her name is chillingly eloquent. That silence may as well have been written by the Los Angeles Police Department of the early 1990s. Because when rendered as words, that silence would say, yes, there were casualties, but no humans were involved. Not so for Edward Eyre. What I know is this. A statue of Eyre is in Victoria Square in the Australian city of Adelaide. A second statue stands in Rumballara Reserve. In 1970, the Australian government issued a postage stamp bearing his portrait. I also know that Lake Eyre, Eyre Peninsula, Eyre Creek, and Eyre Highway, the main highway from South Australia to Western Australia, are named in his honor. So too, Edward John Eyre High School, the Eyre Hotel in Whyalla, and the electoral district of Eyre in Western Australia. So too the villages of Ayrton, West Ayrton, Ayrwell Forest, the Eyre Mountains, and Eyre Creek in New Zealand. And none of this to mention all the Eyre roads and Eyre streets and Eyre avenues that collectively use their miles of asphalt to remember him. There are also radio plays and operas that have remembered the heroic deeds of Latetia Gehagen's killer. For Latetia, however, there is no monument, no road, no avenue. Barrington Watson may have painted her, and Clinton Hutton, bless him, dedicates his book on the Morant Bay Rebellion to her and Paul Bogle. She is not a national hero. I think because she's not respectable enough. She wasn't a school teacher or a deaconess or anything of the sort. If you look back to the historical accounts, you will not find much, as you would not for any black woman of the time. She was an ordinary woman. And precisely because of that, I sometimes wonder what it would mean if we remembered her. If when watching another news report, a woman comes onto the screen hauling into the road a tire or an old stove, or hoisting into the air a placard and shouting into the microphone, "We want justice. We want justice." If only she were to know that this very spirit of an ordinary woman who decided when now go stand feet, that too is a part of our national story, that spirit and energy of defiance, however uncultured it may have looked to the authorities, is part of what brought us here. What would it mean to stop looking for saints and start looking for stories, for the sapiens, for the simple humans who found themselves in tough situations and made brave choices? At the start of this lecture, I said it was more important to ask questions than answers. Let me confess here then that the question which formed the title of this lecture was clumsy and not exactly what I meant. The question isn't, why did we leave the ladies out? There is no mystery to that question. We all know why. The real question is, why do we continue to leave them out? Thank you.
All right. Very, very thought-provoking, very informative, and in many ways moving presentation. Many thanks to Professor Miller for his talk. I'm going to kick off the questions with one of my own, and with a reference to Sylvia Winter, who Professor Miller spoke a bit about in his talk. So Winter, who, as Professor Miller mentioned, is a Jamaican writer, philosopher, playwright, um, was commissioned to write in the early 70s a review of our national heroes, who did not at the time include some of the ones who were later added, including Nanny. Um, so in this piece, Winter talks about heroes not being perfect and uses the example of a narrative hero like a Nancy, who is resourceful and smart, but as we all know, quite unscrupulous at
Mhm.
times, right? And she then poses the following question, and this is quoting from Winter. What then distinguishes the hero? The Greeks had a word for it. They called this quality of the hero his arete. The arete, which means the essential quality of a knife, for example, is its cutting edge, not its carved handle. Winter goes on to say that although, quote, this essential quality of the hero differs from society to society, from age to age, one thing remains the same. It is a quality of energy expressed in choice. And she goes on to speak about heroes not necessarily accomplishing what they set out to accomplish, or in many cases, as with many of the examples provided by Professor Miller, they end up losing their life in the pursuit of, whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And I thought this was a really intriguing example, and this focus on the issue of choice, not necessarily the end result, but the decisions that we make. And I wonder if you could talk, Professor Miller, a little about Miss Lou and Miss Latetia as heroes in terms of the choices and what Winter refers to as the quality of energy. What are some of the choices that we saw Miss Lou make, that we are now learning from you about what Miss Latetia made, that would position them to be considered heroes?
Uh, well, let me say a little bit more about Miss Lou, since that's um as I said, so since I didn't say much about her here. Um, but it comes down for me to, I think how I boil it down to as a sentence is that Miss Lou was doing the work of nation. There are many heroes who did work, who did amazing things, but they weren't consciously doing the work of nation. Miss Lou had that in her mind. Uh, When I think about what makes a nation, nothing is so fundamental to our idea of selves as language, having a common language and having common stories. And of the seven, there were none of them who were working in that field. What I see Miss Lou doing is coming into this new space, into this new nation, and saying, "Geez and peace, here's a new nation. They need language, they need stories, they need folklore." And I think it is worth honoring the person who gave us that background.
Mhm.
In my mind, I think of a nation as being both political and narrative. And so I'm not trying to score politics here, but for me, the two most obvious and indisputable heroes are Norman Washington Manley and Louise Bennett. All the heroes can come after them, but those are the two who fundamentally thought about what does it mean to be a nation and how do we provide this nation with enough background for them to stand up for themselves. So that is my argument for Miss Lou. I just think about the struggle that she goes through from being her first publication in the Focus magazine as being miscellaneous, and how she moves from being miscellaneous to being so foundational. I think that is a kind of heroic story. And so for me, I understand oftentimes, even though I do agree with it, I understand some of the kind of hesitations around Bob Marley because people just think of him as a musician. I would argue he's much more than that. But for Miss Lou, I don't understand it because it is not, for her, it is not about popularity. It is about someone who was working on behalf of Jamaica. And her work always came back to this question of who are we?
Thank you for that response. One of the things you spoke about was the whole business of belonging to a story. And I think a part of what you are articulating about Miss Lou is that she helped to articulate a story for us to belong to,
Right.
which was a valuable part of the nation building process. Can you say more about what I think is an intriguing way to think about nationhood and citizenship, this idea of belonging to a story. Because for many of us, when we think of the places that we connect to, whether it's a particular part of our country or our country as a whole, I don't know that in typical terms we think of it as the belonging to a story, but it's an intriguing concept. And is this an occurrence that sort of is just natural and we all belong to a story? We just have to figure out what. To what extent is there a choice in that process of belonging?
Oh, I mean, there is always choice. I mean, the human as a species, as an animal, we can choose whatever story we belong to, right? Or we always have that agency. I think what I'm working through is how we often don't question those stories.
Mhm.
The human is born into story, and we often just accept the stories that we are born into. I mean, humans rely on narrative, as I said, in a way that no other species does. Um, it is just a simple fact. So we're born into these narratives, whether it's family narratives. So we said these are who our parents are. This is the household. This is who my grandmother was. From very early, we begin to form narratives that begin to explain ourselves. So those narratives begin with the family and they extend to religion, to nation, and we all move through life articulating ourselves as an extension of these stories. That is that is a fundamental fact of the human. And the truth is, most humans will never interrogate those stories. Every single conflict that I can think of in life is always a conflict of narrative. Whether that is an interpersonal conflict all the way to war,
Mhm.
every human conflict is a competition of narratives. Two different groups saying, my story is true, your story is not true. My narrative is more important. Every progress we have made is about the human accommodating different narratives. So what we live in this world is really, for me, becomes this thing of narrative crisis after narrative crisis, and constantly trying to find stories that can accommodate a larger group. What makes one person walk down a street, see someone they have never met before, and spit on them or throw something at them? Story. It is because you imagine that person belongs to that story, and how that person appears to you is always as a character in your own story. Uh, so story is to me really essential. Narrative is not, as I said, it's not just something trivial. It's not just what we study in literature. It is what humans are. Humans are storytelling people who are navigating intricate networks of stories every day. Um, I think for me, uh, I don't know how much further to go, but it is simply how would I put it? It is useful every now and again to find a way to step out of the stories that you are attached to or that you belong to. It's why I said at the beginning, I always want to offer a place, not just inside the narrative, but outside the narrative, to look at ourselves, inventing ourselves and inventing the stories that explain us. And I think probably if we recognize that we're doing it, it just gives us a little more flexibility to be better humans and have better community, rather than all of us thinking that all our stories are true. Does that
That's
make any sense?
it absolutely does. So for those of us in the audience who may not be accustomed to often thinking of themselves and their world in terms of stories, but who are intrigued by what you're saying and this idea of stepping out of their story. Can you say just a little bit more? If I am, someone who I'm like, wow, that Professor Miller, yes, let me try and do this thing. But they're unsure of where to begin. What else can you say about a first step for someone who wants to do exactly what you're describing?
Hmm. Oddly, Andrea, I would not. A lot of this comes to me from Sylvia Winter, but Winter has. I've probably taken 20 years so far to try and unravel all of Winter. I think there are lots of people who approach this in much more accessible ways.
Mm,
I mentioned Yuval Harari, his book Homo Sapiens.
mhm.
It's really wonderful. It's really well researched, and it's a very accommodating read for lots of people. I think I mentioned Stephen Gottschall as well, who has written two books. One is The Storytelling Animal, and another is The Narrative Paradox, both written by him. I'd say just read and be curious, but also just stop to think about it, to ponder these things. I think it's useful for us every now and again to ponder, to sit down and think, what story am I writing here?
Hmm.
Um, is it once you become conscious of the fact that you're doing it,
Hmm.
you see it a lot more, especially you see it in conflicts. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, which narrative is more important here? Which narrative, who is trying to promote which narrative, and why do they believe that narrative so fundamentally?
Hmm.
Um, just gives you a better space, I think.
Great point. And you had also added earlier that, even with personal conflict, there are stories at work. So maybe that is also a good place to begin.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions in the Q&A, and let me invite members of the audience. I think I'd mentioned using the chat before, but that was a bad instruction. I think they want us to use the question and answer. So one question is, with so many Jamaican transplants around the world, how have you seen national heroes being redefined in overseas communities? Have you seen new heroes emerge in new stories abroad or old stories retold in new ways?
Well, of course. Which is exactly why Jamaica is one of the few countries who have official national heroes. Which, sometimes I even question that. I think that is part of our story, and it is what we've done. But I wonder about uh all right, when I think about just the unruliness of Latisha and how, how much she reflects these things that are happening. I always wonder if we can't have heroes rotating,
Mm.
if it isn't good for us to think about who is the hero for now. Like I really feel that you should offer every generation of Jamaicans a chance to choose their heroes, a chance to say, you know what? For now, these are the stories that we're looking to. I think coming into diaspora, moving away from Jamaica, I have been amazed by how audiences gravitate towards someone like Oliver Samuels. I think he's a great ambassador for our culture, a great humorist, and widely intelligent for someone we often dismiss as a mere comedian. I think in the Jamaican diaspora, he becomes a strange kind of new hero for Jamaicans. And the the thing though is that oftentimes, even though I'm talking about heroes, the thing I'm more interested in is story. It always comes back to story for me. For me, a hero is simply that it is a person who features mainly in a story. But there are different ways to tell stories. The point of the story is never the hero. We use the hero as a way to compact the story of the tribe. We want to tell the story of all these people, but it's hard to tell the story of 2 million people. So let's just find a couple, but the important thing behind it is not to say this person is a saint or blah, all of that. It is recognizing what are the stories that are useful for us. What are the stories that we might use to move in the world better, if that make any sense.
It does. And certainly, I guess, in an informal way, we have generational heroes that emerge, but don't necessarily align with the formally chosen
Mhm.
heroes. Um, thank
By
you.
the way, I saw one question that is just a point of fact. What is the name of the painting? I think it's
Oh,
called The
yes.
Uprising by Barrington Watson.
Okay. Thank you. Um, so. Thinking about history, thinking about generation, I don't know if I've ever had this conversation with you, but I came to know your work probably about almost 20 years ago. A journal had reached out to ask me to write a review,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was by this Kai Miller, who I'd not heard of. But the name of the book, the collection was intriguing. It was called The Kingdom of Empty Bellies.
My God, my very, very first book.
It was. And so I read it and I thought it was fabulous. And I said, yes, I'm writing the review, which I did. And so I wanted to take us back to that point in your career for a moment. And if okay, I'm going to read a short excerpt
Okay.
from one of the pieces that I had quite enjoyed. So this is Kai's work here. Let them sound an alarm. Make the Savior find me sprawl out on the pavement. Make them push trolleys to meet me. One whole heap of noise. Make them scream. Sound the sirens. Let ambulance light flicker like flame, like Pentecost, like hallelujah. So, one of my comments in the review was that your poems, and I'm quoting from myself, explore spirituality within a distinctly feminized context, persistently revisiting notions of the divine shaped by female experience, and mingle the seemingly contradictory melange of spiritual reverence with turbulent emotions and sensuality. And I go on to say that your portrayal of a kind of irreverent celebration is compelling and it conjures up a genus of rebellious spiritual passion that resists conforming to westernized middle class ideals of propriety. So, um,
Hmm.
a question that I have for you is how did Kingdom of Empty Bellies lead you to this moment where we are and all that has come between? So, can you talk a little about your professional journey as a writer to help us learn just a little more about you?
Oh, wow. That's a fascinating question. I mean, more because I wonder if you'd be a little disappointed in the answer. I think something happened since moving here to Miami where it doesn't have to do with the move to Miami, it just has to do with where I am. I think I've taken a break from writing, and this is only the first time I'm sharing the
Mm,
new place where I think my mind is, which I find is sometimes much more abstract, theoretical. Uh, and I think there's an earnestness that I had when I was writing Kingdom of Interbills that I don't think I have anymore.
mhm,
I and yet all of those things that you mentioned are still important to me. Looking at, I guess, the unsung hero,
yeah.
looking at the act at work by. Okay, I guess Kingdom of Interbills comes out of being an uptown Jamaican kid who is disappointed by uptownness.
Mm,
Um, who has a mother from rural Jamaica who just seems to have access to all kinds of other expressions which I find lacking in the more suburban Mona communities that I live in. And so some of it is me trying to access this world that my mother has access to, which is which it seems like there's an intelligence there that my mother always had that my father didn't have, for instance. My father was much more, you could call it naive, but it was, but my mother was sharp. And for some reason, I rooted the sharpness of her intelligence to just having access to different kinds of community. And
mhm,
so I think that collection is coming out of that place. I'm in my 20s. I have only recently just dropped out from the university. This is before I will go back. And somehow, without a first degree, managed to get a master's and a PhD, which is a whole other story. But that that first book is coming out of that period. But it's leading me into a world of writing and a world of reading and a world of really, really thinking with as much complexity as I think I can about Jamaican culture, which is always where I think I will land. Um, but yeah, the thing about journeys is that so much of the journey means if you're doing the journey well, you're not always walking forward, you have to walk back. You
for
have to
sure.
go, all right, yeah, but let me revise that idea. And because I've revised that idea, let me step back for a while before I walk forward. And
Mhm.
that's just what intellectual, a life of the mind does. Um, yeah, I'll stop there.
All right. And I mean, it seems that we are in many ways back to the start of your talk and the idea of a story, that there was an interest in certain types of stories. So, remember I'd asked the question, you said, yeah, we have a choice in the stories to which we
Absolutely.
belong. And you were exercising that choice.
Mhm.
And somehow Kingdom of Empty Bellies, kind of emerged in some ways from those decisions.
Mhm.
All right, thank you. So I see we have some more questions. So someone asks, could you please speak more about your thoughts on the out of many narrative and whether you think its use and implications have shifted since the previous time period you mentioned? And the person continues to say, I have issue with how it has been used to oppress Black Jamaicans historically. But for me, as a Chinese Jamaican, I find that just asserting my identity as a Jamaican immediately gets attached to this narrative.
Yeah, wow, that okay, so my opinions certainly have changed. I again, I for a long time I was very dismissive of out of many one people as a narrative, right? Um, but so much of Jamaica changes over time, right? So we have this period of Hushera, um, where the government is trying to suppress these expressions of Black nationalism, right? That's a weird corner. In the 1990s, things begin to shift. And Deborah Thomas writes so brilliantly about what happens in that moment that suddenly turns Blackness into a really useful political identity for Jamaica to embrace. But when I was just growing up, Jamaica was like, even Jamaicans who look like me, it was very important for every Jamaican to assert our creolity. The fact that no matter how you're Black, we're all mixed. Everyone is mixed. It was very important that out of many was, the identity, that there was a different kind of Blackness. We had a creolized Blackness, not a pure Blackness. Um, my my thoughts of the out of many one people, I guess why I'm suspicious of it at times is that oftentimes I find that out of many one people is used in the same way that um, all lives matter is used.
Mhm.
Whenever there's a discussion that where you begin to feel uncomfortable about, the accusations being made, whenever we don't want to hear it anymore, that discussion becomes too painful. I feel we invoke out of many one people to silence that kind of discussion. That is my hesitation about it. But honestly, I believe in out of many one people. I think that is the point. That is absolutely where we're supposed to go. Again, when we go back to story, I guess I have to think about what are the collective fictions that we created and that we live inside. Um, so if I go back to this idea of telling stories and how stories define humanity, I get to this moment where I realize we create different. I guess growing up in university, we used to call them uh what you used to call them social constructs.
Mhm.
What social construct is just a collective fiction. It's things that have nothing to do, that have no basis in the natural world, but by virtue of our agreement, we have called those things into existence. So, for instance, there's no such thing as law. There is no tree that bears law. There is no animal that creates law. Law is an invention of us, but we all agree on it. And so even though law is a concept and it's an abstraction, the human makes it real. And so law is abstract, but the policeman in the uniform is real. The judge in her robes is real. The jailhouse is real. The electric chair is real. So much of our fictions we make reality. That is how humans move in this world like gods, in a way that no other creature does. Race is a collective fiction, and it's a collective fiction that I think is coming to the point of exhaustion. It has no basis in, but we have made it real. And why are we committed to those kinds of narratives? Is a kind of question I ask. I think race is a distraction of the human. If that's a weird way to say it, but if
Mhm.
there is actually no biological difference between us, and we have created this thing called race, which is a fiction that we move in, that is compelling, that we find really interesting narratives and really compelling narratives inside that fiction, uh, we just have to, for me, we have to understand our reliance on that. And And I see in society those moments when we try to create larger fictive spaces or larger frameworks which can accommodate a larger group of Homo sapiens. That is what society always does. Society is always trying to create narratives that can accommodate a larger group of people. And that is certainly the ambition of out of many one people. And so no, I certainly feel that that is the direction that every society ought to move in, and that at some point you have to acknowledge just the fictiveness of race as a construct, just as we have to acknowledge the fictiveness of the economy as a
Mhm.
construct. You know, all these fictions that we are committed to, why are we committed to them? How do those fictions benefit us? Is there a way to create another kind of fiction that is more quote unquote true, but that is more beneficial for a larger group of people?
Mhm.
That's how societies always move. We created fictions before in which disabled people could not participate in our society. Every single generation has to say, no, 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 that narrative is insufficient for all the humans around us. How do we create a more inclusive fiction to live in? We cannot not live inside fiction. That is just who the human is. But how do you create a better fiction?
Yes, thank you for that. And certainly with regards to gender also, there has
Yes.
been, the progression of those narratives and changes. All right, thanks for that answer. Um, we have another question. One is on a practical level, just asking again for Letitia's last name.
Oh, Geoghegan.
Go Hagan. Can you spell it for us?
It is Geohagen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, another question regarding one of your comments. Question is, what are you disappointed about with Uptownness?
Uh, we are always so sure that we are right. It's just that it is a weird arrogance of Uptown that always believes that what is respectable and what is manageable and what is polite
Mhm.
is what is right. It feels that oftentimes I feel we are more, and I will always, when I use uptown, I'm always going to call it we because it is a society that I come from. We're just arrogant sometimes, and we don't. There's just so many times when we don't get it,
Mhm.
you know. That's and and let me say just by the way, because I see Maxine has put the whole name, and I have spelled it wrong. Before. So there are two spellings I found in the history book. One is actually Letitia, as I spell it right there, or in other documents I've seen it spelled Letitia with a C, but my LA was wrong. So if you're looking her up, it's either Letitia or Let, or yeah, sorry, that should be Leticia,
Letitia.
Letitia. So that was my error.
All right, thank you. All right, I think we may have time for one more question. So we have a question here in the chat. Is there a similar line of erasure with Miss Letitia with woman and Jamaica's radical tradition with fire? The person who started the fire, who kickstarted the 1831 Christmas Rebellion, but in the same way, Sam Sharp is elevated to national status. She's not even remembered in the history of the story or even broadly a Jamaican history. And secondly, in your opinion, do you advise taking an approach like what Bermuda did with Mary Prince and her new status of national hero? So it's a lot. You want me to?
Yeah. No, no, I'm reading
Oh,
and
yeah, you can see it. All right.
so Um, no, that is just fascinating to me. So I won't answer that because I don't know that story. It is so obvious how, as I said, why did we leave the ladies out? Was such a badly formed question because
But
I
relative, relevant though.
yeah, yes, relevant. But a parliament of only men, of only of mainly light-skinned Jamaican men, was going to select a group of national heroes where it was majority brown men. As I said, it was first five. So it's Alexander Bustamante, Norman Manley, and George William Gordon. Those really are the heroes. They have to put in Paul Bogle because you can't put in George William Gordon without putting Paul Bogle. And then Marcus Garvey is thrown in as an appeasement to the we know why they selected those four. So that story, I actually don't know anything about the woman who starts the fire. Thank you for kind of putting something in my brain for me to explore that link. So I actually don't know much about that. But it seems like it is completely linked and the same set of circumstances. So again, for me, the more important question is not why did they, but why do we now? Like, is it important for us to tell that story differently and to find other angles of the story, to find out who was left out? And can we tell better stories for ourselves?
All right, so let's see if we can fit in one because we only have one outstanding question. So,
Okay.
uh, love the discussion on storytelling, Professor Miller. Love the all lives matter example for out of oneness. My question, in an age of short attention spans and digital noise, what are your strategies for capturing and maintaining an audience's attention throughout an entire story?
Oh, wow. Come to my creative writing classes. Yeah, you see, in some ways, those answers are not, um, like I'm always trying to be honest with my answers, right? I could give some philosophical answers, but storytelling is craft. um, telling telling the end of a story before the beginning, so people know what is going to come next. So you have their attention because they need to know. I mean, a lot of these are craft decisions. I completely agree with a storyteller being ultimately a manipulator.
True.
You want to hook people, and those are, every artist, whether you are a pianist or a dancer, there is craft that comes into that. And so yeah, I think outside of any kind of philosophical thought, you have to go back to craft. And what does it mean to be an artist, and what does it mean to craft your art? Um, and that is just a long apprenticeship. That is reading every story you can. But to tell a story, you are not owed anyone's attention. You have to earn it, is my idea.
Yeah, it's so true. I had a writing teacher who had a book, and it was called The Lie That Tells a Truth. And it was this book about creative writing. So, in your comment about being a manipulator, we're really lying, right? To get people's attention in our crafting of fiction in particular. Um, all right, so I think that we're a little over time, so I just want to say thank you again, Professor Miller, for a presentation that was very informative. And even for me, who I've spent a lot of time thinking of story, your presentation is pushing me to think about it a bit more in a somewhat different context, and I'm really appreciative for that.
Okay.
So I am going to
Thank
hand
you.
over to Marcia Ward.
Mm.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks to all responsible for this sixth annual Louise Bennett Coverley Heritage Memorial Lecture. Sincere thanks to Professor Kai Miller for presenting a thought-provoking lecture, giving us a fresh perspective on Jamaican history, that our history has many omissions, with heroes long forgotten to the detriment of the people, their identity, their spirit. And this needs to be appreciated. Your question, does the national narrative have room for more stories, has given us much food for thought. So thank you again for raising our consciousness on this matter. I would also like to thank our moderator, Professor Andrea Nevins, who has once again taken time from her busy schedule to artfully facilitate this event. For giving our program some cultural flavor, Much thanks is due to Sophia Nichols for her rendition of Jamaican Women and to the Talawamento Band for the beautiful folk music which opened this program. I would also like to recognize our major financial sponsor, Broward Cultural Division, and also Broward County Libraries, which hosted this virtual presentation. And last but not least, the planning committee responsible for organizing this event, Maxine Plummer, Sheena Sewell, Donna Lee Raymond, and Valerie Simpson. As you may already know, the mission of the Louise Bennett Coverley Heritage Council is to preserve and promote the works and legacy of the Honorable Louise Bennett Coverley. Some of the ways in which we do this is by staging cultural events throughout the year and providing scholarships for students attending the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts in Kingston, Jamaica. If you want to know more about the council and would like to support its work and keep the culture alive, passing it along to the younger generation, please visit our website at www.louisebennettheritage.com. Kindly make a donation. It's really for a worthy cause. And beyond that, see how you can be a part of the vision. And finally, I would like to share news about a couple exciting upcoming events. The first one will take place on Saturday, June the 21st at 6 p.m. And the Talawamento Band will be presenting Evening Time at the Lauderhill Performing Arts Center. This concert promises to be a truly enjoyable event, and proceeds from this event will be used to support Talawamento Band and the Jamaica Folk Review's trip to Ghana, Africa to participate in Panafest 2025. This is a first time for them, so please support this event. For tickets, call 954-328-6963 or check our website again at louisebennettheritage.com. And secondly, in celebration of Miss Lou's birthday, we will be hosting an event titled Styling 2025, Fui Roots, Fui Culture, on September 21st and 20th. On September 20th and September 21st. This is a fashion show and musical extravaganza which you can't afford to miss, as it will feature clothing lines from fashion houses such as Hope Wade Designs and Culture Clothes here in Miami and others. Live music, comedy, and a showcase of vendors will round out the evening for what promises to be a fabulous event. Again, check out our website for tickets for Evening Time and check back in July for details about Styling 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for joining us this afternoon, and as Miss Lou would say, walk good.
Jamaica Woman by Louise Bennett. Jamaica Woman Conisa is how them gin also. Look how long them liberated and the man them never know. Look how long Jamaica woman, mother, sister, wife, sweetheart, outer road and inner yard, they pan a dominate her part. From maroon nanny take her body, bounce bullet back per man, to when nowadays girl picnic on spelling bee champion. From the grassroots to the hilltop, in profession, skill, and trade, Jamaica woman take her time the mount and make the grade. Some back a man a push, some side a man a hold him hand, some a lick sense in a man head, some a guide him pan him plan. Neck and foot with man, she buckle whole her own, while man a call her so rib, woman a turn backbone. And long before woman li broke out over foreign land, Jamaica female was a worker liberated plan. Jamaica woman know she strong. She know she talawa. But she no want her picnic them to start call her pupa. So the Connie Jama woman go on like pantsuit is a style. And Jamaican man no know say she wear the trousers all the while. So Jamaica woman coaxing family budget from explode. And so Jamaica man a sing, woman a heavy load, woman a heavy load, woman a heavy load, when Saturday morning come. But the Connie Jama woman ban her belly, bite her tongue, catch water, put pot pan fire, and dig her to a ground. For woman lock their dongle, some rooted more than some. But as long as fowl a scratch dongle heap, woman luck must come. Little man start to praise her. Day by day the praise her grow. So him praise her. So it's sweet her. For she wonder if him know. Aye, aye, aye.
Thank you, everyone. At this point, we will end the webinar.